The southern Peloponnese lies under a sun that has burned for millennia, a sun that turns the limestone hills the color of honey and makes the olive leaves flash silver when the wind comes off the Ionian Sea. The land here is old in a way that defies measurement, its age not marked by centuries, but by the rise and fall of civilizations whose bones are buried in its soil. In Messenia, the air is thick with the scent of wild thyme, and the hum of cicadas drowns out the modern world. It is a place where the past feels close, so close that if you pressed your ear to the ground, you might hear the faint thud of bronze-clad footsteps. On a low hill above the Pamisos River Valley, there once stood a palace. It was not the largest in the Mycenaean world, nor the most famous, but it was proud and strong, a beacon of power in a network of Bronze Age kingdoms that spanned the Aegean. Its name was Nichoria, from its megaron, the great hall that was the heart of every Mycenaean palace. Its rulers could look down upon fertile fields, trade routes to the coast, and the distant shimmer of the sea. For perhaps 2 centuries, this palace thrived. And then, like so many of its kin, it vanished. To the modern traveler, Nichoria is little more than an uneven rise in the earth. Grasses wave where columns once stood. The stones that formed its walls now lie scattered and half-buried. There are no marble facades or grand staircases to greet the eye, only the quiet persistence of the land reclaiming what was once its own. For centuries, it was forgotten, absent from maps and memory alike. Even in the shadow of its more famous neighbor, the palace of Nestor at Pylos, Nichoria slipped into the long night of history. And yet, the ground remembers. When archaeologists first came to survey the site in the 1960s, they were struck by the density of pottery shards, the faint outline of walls beneath the soil, the way the terrain seemed to whisper of human design. Each spade of earth brought fragments of a vanished world into the light, fragments that hinted at a story of ambition, prosperity, and sudden loss. The Mycenaean civilization, at its height between 1600 and 1200 BCE, was a tapestry woven from threads of trade, war, and artistry. Its palaces were more than royal residences. They were administrative centers, warehouses, and religious sanctuaries, each radiating influence across the surrounding countryside. Nichoria's palace, though smaller than Pylos or Mycenae, was part of this intricate network. It absorbed goods from nearby farms, managed local affairs, and perhaps played a role in the region's defense. But the same interconnectedness that sustained it also made it vulnerable. When the Mycenaean world began to unravel in the late 13th century BCE, Nichoria's fate was sealed. Archaeological evidence tells us that the palace met its end in fire. Charred beams, layers of ash, and collapsed stone suggest a sudden catastrophe. Whether this was the work of foreign invaders, local uprisings, or the indifferent force of an earthquake remains an open question. In the centuries that followed, the site was reduced to a smaller village, stripped of its palatial grandeur. Over time, even that dwindled, and the earth covered what was left. The story of Nichoria's disappearance is not unique, but it is emblematic. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the end of the Late Bronze Age saw the collapse of long-established powers: the Hittites in Anatolia, the Ugaritic kingdom on the Syrian coast, the Egyptian withdrawal from Canaan, and the fall of palace cultures across Greece. Theories abound: climate change, systemic economic failure, invasions by the enigmatic sea peoples, but no single cause fits every case. Nichoria stands as one piece in a vast, shattered mosaic. To ask what happened to the Palace of Nichoria is to ask a larger question about how civilizations die. Is it a single blow, swift and final, or a slow erosion, 1,000 small cuts until the heart can beat no longer? And when the buildings fall, what happens to the people who once walked those halls? These questions have haunted archaeologists and historians for decades, driving them to sift through the dust of ages for answers that may never be complete. This journey into Nichoria's past will not be a simple excavation of facts. It will be a weaving together of landscapes and ruins, of pottery and pollen grains, of the silent testimony of bones and the faint echoes of ancient footsteps. It will take us from the age of palaces to the twilight of the Bronze Age, from the rediscovery of the site in modern times to the debates that still rage among scholars. Along the way, we will confront the limits of what can be known, and the spaces where history blurs into legend. For in the end, Nichoria is more than a ruin. It is a reminder that nothing is permanent, that power and beauty can vanish and yet still shape the world through the stories they leave behind. The land has swallowed the palace, but in its stones, its ash, and its silence, the palace still speaks. The hill rises gently from the surrounding plain, its slopes dressed in the muted greens of wild olive and the deep, resinous tones of cypress. In spring, the ground bursts into a quilt of anemones, poppies, and chamomile, flowers threading themselves between the stones as if to reclaim the walls that once stood here. Nichoria's hill is neither especially high nor daunting to climb, but it commands a view that would have been invaluable in the age before radar and satellite. From its crest, the horizon sweeps in a great arc, from the distant blue line of the Ionian Sea to the rolling inland hills where the first shadows of Mount Tigitos begin to rise. In the late Bronze Age, this location was more than scenic, it was strategic. The Mycenaean plain was a gift to any who could hold it, its deep, fertile soils yielding grain, olives, and grapes in abundance. Rainfall here is generous by Greek standards, thanks to the winter storms that sweep in from the west, and the Pamisos River, winding lazily through the plain, would have provided water for crops and livestock alike. This was not an isolated outpost. To the west, just beyond the ridges, lay sheltered harbors and access to maritime trade routes that stretched across the Aegean and beyond. To the north and east, overland paths connected Nichoria to neighboring settlements, including the great palace of Pylos, whose influence radiated over the entire region. From the vantage of Nichoria's summit, a watchman could track movement across the plain, whether the approach of traders laden with amphorae of oil and wine, or the dust of an advancing force. In an age when control over land and sea lanes meant survival, such a view was as valuable as gold. This commanding position likely explains why a Mycenaean palace rose here in the first place. The Mycenaean world was not a loose scattering of independent villages. It was an interconnected system of fortified palatial centers, each serving as the administrative heart of a surrounding territory. These palaces were both practical and symbolic. Practical in their ability to store grain, manage herds, and oversee craft production. Symbolic in their monumental architecture, which projected the power of the ruling elite. Nichoria's palace, while smaller than some of its more famous counterparts, was no less significant within its local sphere. Archaeological surveys have revealed traces of a megaron, the rectangular hall with a central hearth, around which the political and ceremonial life of the palace revolved. From this space, the wanax, or ruler, could have presided over councils, distributed goods, and conducted rituals to honor the gods who guarded the land and sea. Yet the hill's importance predates the palace itself. Excavations have shown evidence of earlier habitation, suggesting that Nichoria may have begun as a modest settlement centuries before it grew into a Mycenaean administrative center. The choice of this particular rise was likely influenced by its defensibility and access to resources. The surrounding countryside could support agriculture on a scale sufficient not only for local needs, but for surplus production. Critical in the Bronze Age economy, where surplus meant trade, alliances, and the wealth to build in stone. To understand the hill's place in its landscape, one must imagine the Mycenaean plain in its ancient state. Without the patchwork of modern roads and concrete buildings, the land would have stretched in broad, uninterrupted swathes of cultivated fields, dotted with clusters of houses built of mud brick and timber. The air would have been filled with the sounds of animal bells, the rhythmic thud of pestles and mortars, and the distant crash of waves against rocky coves. From Nichoria's crest, one could follow the sinuous lines of the river toward the coast, knowing that beyond the horizon lay not emptiness, but a web of islands and harbors, each node in a network of exchange that tied Greece to Crete, Anatolia, and even Egypt. It is easy to forget, standing there today amid the cicada hum, that this was once a place of intense human energy. The hill would have been crowned by the palace complex, stone foundations supporting walls of sun-dried brick, their surfaces perhaps painted in bright pigments that have long since faded. Roofs of wooden beams and clay tiles would have sheltered storerooms packed with oil jars, grain bins, and chests of finished goods ready for trade. Workshops would have clattered with the sound of bronze being hammered into weapons and tools, while outside the walls, farmers and herders brought their produce in to be recorded, taxed, and redistributed. The palace was more than a residence. It was the beating heart of an economic machine. But geography, for all its advantages, is never a guarantee of permanence. Nichoria's hill, while offering a commanding view and fertile lands, was also exposed to forces beyond human control. The region sits within reach of seismic fault lines. Earthquakes are as much a part of the Peloponnesian landscape as its mountains and seas. Moreover, the very openness of the Mycenaean plain, which allowed for easy movement of goods, also left it vulnerable to the movement of armies. A position that can see far is also a position that can be seen. When modern archaeologists first began to map the site in the mid-20th century, they approached it not only with spades and trowels, but with aerial photography, soil analysis, and an understanding of how ancient communities used their landscapes. They noted the alignment of the palace remains with the slope of the hill, the proximity to water sources, and the traces of ancient roads that converged toward its gates. What emerged was a portrait of a place that was deliberately chosen and carefully shaped to serve both practical and symbolic functions. One of the most revealing aspects of Nichoria's geography is its relationship to Pylos. The two sites are close enough that signals, whether by fire, horn, or runner, could have passed between them in a matter of hours. This proximity suggests that Nichoria may have been a subordinate center, a node in the administrative web of Pylos. The hill's position allowed it to oversee a section of the plain that might otherwise have been difficult for Pylos to control directly. In this sense, Nichoria was both an extension of a greater power and a power in its own right. Yet even as we reconstruct its ancient significance, we must also confront the fragility of such places. The hill above the sea was, for all its vantage and fertility, bound to the fortunes of the Mycenaean world. When that world began to falter, the palace here would have had little chance to stand alone. The very network that had made Nichoria prosperous would, in collapse, leave it exposed and isolated. Today, standing on the hilltop, the sea is a glimmer in the distance, its color shifting with the wind. The fields below still yield olives and grain, much as they did 3,000 years ago. But the human structures that once crowned this rise are gone, reduced to faint outlines and scattered stones. The geography remains, but the society that mastered it has passed into memory, its story pieced together from fragments. Nichoria's hill is a reminder that landscapes are both stage and actor in history. They shape human choices, and in turn, they are shaped by those choices, fortified, cultivated, and, eventually, abandoned. To understand what happened to the lost Mycenaean palace of Nichoria, we must first see it as its rulers did, a place of power and promise, a hill above the sea, watching over a world that seemed, for a time, unshakable. In the centuries before Nichoria's palace crowned the hill, the southern Mycenaean plain was a mosaic of small communities, each clinging to its own piece of the fertile land. These early settlements, scattered along streams and sheltered ridges, were bound together by kinship ties, seasonal trade, and the rhythms of agricultural life. The people who lived here were skilled in coaxing abundance from the soil, planting barley and wheat in winter, tending groves of olive and fig in the summer, and maintaining herds of sheep and goats whose wool and milk sustained them year-round. It was in this environment that the seeds of a more centralized authority began to sprout. As elsewhere in the Aegean, the centuries between 1700 and 1400 BC saw profound changes. Trade networks expanded, metallurgy advanced, and ambitious leaders began to consolidate power. In Messenia, these shifts set the stage for the emergence of palatial centers. Fortified compounds that served as both the administrative and symbolic heart of their territories. Nichoria was among these, though it likely began humbly, perhaps as the residence of a local chieftain who oversaw a cluster of nearby villages. The transition from chiefdom to palace culture was neither sudden nor inevitable. It required both opportunity and pressure. Opportunity came in the form of increasing interaction with the wider Mycenaean world. Pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and architectural innovations flowed along the trade routes from Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes. Pressure came from the demands of defending territory and managing resources in a competitive landscape. By around 1400 BCE, these forces had coalesced into something larger and more ambitious, a stronghold that would command not just the hilltop, but the surrounding countryside as well. Archaeological excavations at Nichoria have uncovered the outlines of this transformation. The Megaron, the great hall that symbolized Mycenaean authority, was built atop earlier structures, its stone foundations supporting walls of mud brick. At the center of the hall, a circular hearth burned in honor of the gods, its smoke rising through an opening in the roof. Around the Megaron spread storerooms, workshops, and administrative spaces, each serving a specific role in the palace economy. Large pithoi, storage jars, were sunk into the floors to hold oil, grain, and other staples. Sealstones and clay tablets, inscribed in the Linear B script, attest to a bureaucratic system that tracked production, taxation, and distribution with remarkable precision. The palace's power rested on its ability to control the flow of goods. Farmers brought in part of their harvest as tribute, which was stored, recorded, and later redistributed. Artisans produced goods under palace oversight: bronze tools and weapons, fine pottery, and textiles woven from the wool of palace-controlled flocks. Some of these goods were consumed locally, others were traded across the Aegean, bringing in exotic materials like amber, ivory, and tin for bronze. This economic centralization was not merely practical. It reinforced the authority of the Wanax and his administrators, who could position themselves as the providers and protectors of the community. Yet the rise of Nichoria was not solely an economic story. It was also one of cultural alignment. As the palace expanded, so too did the adoption of Mycenaean religious and artistic traditions. Shrines within or near the palace complex housed figurines of deities, some recognizably Greek in later tradition, others more enigmatic. Ritual feasting likely took place in the Megaron, where the ruler and his companions would consume roasted meat and wine in ceremonies that fused political authority with divine sanction. Frescoes, now reduced to mere flakes of pigment, once adorned the walls, depicting processions, hunting scenes, and abstract motifs that mirrored the visual language of other Mycenaean centers. Nichoria's rise must also be understood in the context of its relationship to Pylos. Whether as a semi-independent ally or as an administrative satellite, the palace on the hill was part of a regional hierarchy dominated by the Palace of Nestor. The scale of construction at Pylos dwarfed Nichoria's own, but the two sites shared architectural features and material culture, suggesting close ties. Linear B tablets from Pylos record officials with titles that might correspond to local governors, men who could have resided in places like Nichoria, administering outlying districts in the Wanax's name. If so, Nichoria's stronghold was both a symbol of local prestige and a node in a much larger web of power. Daily life within the palace walls reflected this dual role. In the early mornings, scribes sat in the shade of colonnaded porches, inscribing tablets with stylus and damp clay. Messengers came and went, carrying orders or reports. The clang of bronze echoed from the smithy, where molten metal was poured into stone molds. Outside the walls, the fields were alive with laborers, men guiding plows pulled by oxen, women gathering olives into baskets, children driving flocks to pasture. All of it, every jar of oil, every fleece, every ingot, was drawn toward the palace, where it became part of the machinery of power. By the late 14th century BCE, Nichoria had achieved the stature of a true Mycenaean stronghold. Its rulers could muster warriors in defense of the plain, host emissaries from other centers, and participate in the prestige economy that bound the Aegean elite together. Ships from Mycenaean ports may have carried goods as far as Cyprus or the Levant, returning with copper, gold, and stories of distant lands. The palace's storerooms swelled with wealth, and its ceremonies reinforced the idea that this hilltop was the rightful heart of its domain. But the very success of such a system carried within it the seeds of vulnerability. The concentration of resources in the palace meant that any disruption, whether from drought, war, or political upheaval, would ripple quickly through the community. The reliance on regional networks tied Nichoria's fate to that of Pylos and the wider Mycenaean world. In times of stability, These connections brought prosperity. In times of crisis, they could transmit instability as swiftly as goods. For now, though, in the height of its power, Nichoria stood as a testament to what could be built on a fertile hill above the sea. Its rise was the result of vision, opportunity, and the careful weaving together of economic, military, and religious authority. The stone foundations laid in this era would endure for millennia, long after the wooden beams had rotted and the painted walls had faded. And yet, as history would prove, even the most enduring stone cannot shield a palace from the storms of time. The Palace of Nichoria, at its zenith, was not a static monument of stone and clay. It was a living organism, breathing through the movements of its people, the pulse of its economy, and the rituals that bound them together. From dawn until the embers of the night fires faded, its courtyards, storerooms, workshops, and halls hummed with activity. The day began with the first light over the Ionian Sea spilling across the hills. In the open courtyards, servants swept away dust and leaves carried in by the night wind. The air smelled of damp earth and smoldering hearths. In the Megaron, the ceremonial heart of the palace, a small flame still burned at the central hearth, tended through the night by attendants who believed that letting it go out would invite misfortune. The Megaron's wide doorway, framed by painted columns, opened onto a porch where guards stood watch, their bronze weapons catching the morning light. Inside the palace walls, life followed rhythms that were both practical and symbolic. Scribes, many of them young men trained from adolescence, assembled in a side chamber where shelves of unfired clay tablets awaited the day's records. With stylus in hand, they pressed the angular signs of linear B into the wet clay, tallies of grain shipments, inventories of livestock, lists of craftsmen assigned to palace projects. The language they wrote was an early form of Greek, though their audience was small, primarily the administrators and overseers who kept the palace's vast machinery running. Beyond the administrative wing, the storerooms exuded a rich mixture of scents, the peppery bite of freshly pressed olive oil, the sweetness of figs stored in baskets, the faint metallic tang of bronze ingots stacked for future use. Here, women worked under the eye of supervisors, sorting goods, repairing sacks, and measuring out portions for redistribution. In one corner, massive pit hoi, half buried in the packed earth floor, held reserves of grain. Their wide mouths were sealed with clay and stamped with seals bearing the insignia of the palace, a warning against tampering. In the workshops, craftsmen honed the skills that set Mycenaean culture apart. Bronzesmiths poured molten metal into stone molds, producing blades, chisels, and spearheads. Potters at the wheel shaped vessels for cooking, storage, and display, their hands guiding the clay with practiced precision. Textile production was among the palace's most important industries. In rooms lined with upright looms, women wove fine wool into patterned cloth, some of which would be dyed with imported pigments in deep reds and brilliant blues. The finest of these garments might be worn by the ruling elite or sent as gifts to secure alliances. The palace's social hierarchy was woven into its architecture. The ruling Wanax, the king, occupied quarters set apart from the bustle, their walls painted with scenes of hunting, processions, and perhaps mythic narratives now lost to us. These images were more than decoration. They were declarations of legitimacy, tying the ruler's authority to divine favor and heroic tradition. His meals were prepared in separate kitchens, his personal guard chosen from among the most loyal warriors. Close to him was the Lawagidas, the military leader, whose role was vital in both defense and ceremonial display. The rest of the palace's population spanned a wide spectrum. High-ranking officials and their families, priests and priestesses who tended to the gods' shrines, skilled artisans, lower-status laborers, and servants whose lives were entirely bound to the demands of their superiors. Many lived in the outlying settlement beyond the palace walls, traveling in each day to work. Others, particularly specialists whose skills were too valuable to risk, were housed within the compound itself. Religion permeated life at Nichoria. The palace maintained altars both indoors and in open courtyards, where offerings of grain, oil, wine, and incense were made to the gods. Figurines of goddesses with upraised arms, bull motifs, and bird symbols hint at a complex pantheon that blended Aegean traditions with local cults. On festival days, the entire community might gather in the palace forecourt, where the Wanax would preside over sacrifices. These events were both acts of devotion and demonstrations of wealth, reinforcing the palace's role as mediator between the human and divine realms. The Megaron itself was the stage for the most important rituals and receptions. Here, the central hearth blazed during banquets attended by the elite. The air would be thick with the scent of roasted meat and honeyed wine, the walls echoing with the steady rhythm of lyres and the rise and fall of singers' voices. Guests reclined on couches, engaged in the politics of conversation as much as in the pleasures of the feast. In these gatherings, alliances were cemented, disputes resolved, and the ruler's authority reaffirmed before the eyes of his peers. Beyond the formal events, the palace functioned as a hub for the broader region's needs. Farmers brought their produce to the gates, where officials inspected and recorded each delivery. Shepherds arrived with sheep for shearing, their animals penned outside until they could be processed. In return, the palace redistributed food, tools, and other goods, ensuring a measure of stability in times of scarcity. This reciprocity, though heavily weighted in favor of the elite, helped maintain the loyalty of the surrounding population. Children grew up in the shadow of these walls, their lives shaped by the rhythms of palace service. Sons of administrators might be apprenticed as scribes, learning to read and write in the rarefied language of power. Daughters of artisans learned weaving, dyeing, and the management of household stores. For the lower classes, the future often meant the same labor their parents performed, with little chance of advancement. Yet even in such a rigid hierarchy, the palace provided a sense of identity and belonging that extended beyond the individual. At night, the palace shifted into a different rhythm. Torches cast flickering light along colonnaded halls, and the sounds of the workshops faded into the distant barking of dogs. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their shadows sliding over the stone walls. In the Megaron, the central fire was banked to embers, but never extinguished. Somewhere in the storerooms, a mouse rustled among the sacks, a reminder that even in a seat of power, life's smaller dramas played out unseen. For all its grandeur, the palace was not immune to strain. Maintaining such a complex required constant resources: labor, raw materials, food. In years of poor harvest, the demands of the palace could become a burden on the countryside, breeding resentment. Diplomacy with neighboring centers could be tense, as trade and tribute were both lifelines and points of contention. Beneath the polished surface of banquets and processions, there were undercurrents of uncertainty, currents that would, in time, swell into the storms that swept away the Mycenaean world. But in its prime, life in the palace of Nichoria embodied the heights of what the Mycenaean system could achieve. It was a place where art, administration, religion, and economy converged, each reinforcing the other in a delicate balance. It was a world ordered by hierarchy and ritual, by the turning of seasons and the cycles of tribute. And it was a world that seemed, to those who lived within it, as enduring as the hills themselves. The Palace of Nichoria may have been the heart of its domain, but the lifeblood that sustained it flowed from beyond its stone walls. The surrounding countryside was more than a backdrop. It was an intricate web of fields, villages, pastures, and coastal routes, each tied to the palace through a system of tribute, obligation, and mutual dependence. To understand Nichoria, one must step outside its gates and walk the land that gave it life. The terrain of Messenia in the late Bronze Age was both a gift and a challenge. Rolling hills descended to fertile plains, where the soil, enriched by seasonal rains, could yield wheat, barley, and pulses in abundance. Olive trees, with their gnarled trunks and shimmering leaves, stood in neat rows on terraced slopes, their fruit pressed into the rich oil that was as much a currency as a food. Closer to the coast, figs and grapes flourished, their sweetness concentrated by the long, hot summers. In the distance, the Ionian Sea offered fish, shellfish, and trade routes that connected Nichoria to a wider Aegean world. Life in the villages that dotted this landscape was shaped by the demands of both nature and the palace. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their crops, working by hand and with the help of ox-drawn plows. Shepherds led their flocks to pasture, moving with the seasons to avoid overgrazing. Every household was part of a network that funneled surplus goods toward the palace: grain for storage, livestock for slaughter or breeding, wool for weaving, and timber for construction or shipbuilding. In return, the palace offered protection, tools, and the redistribution of goods during hard times. The arrangement was not purely benevolent. Palace officials, overseers, tax collectors, and inspectors traveled the countryside to ensure that quotas were met. Records from linear B tablets at other Mycenaean sites show that such officials were meticulous, noting the exact number of animals, measures of grain, or jars of oil owed by each settlement. While no such tablets have survived from Nichoria itself, the parallels are too strong to ignore. Failure to meet obligations could lead to punitive measures, though the exact nature of these remains uncertain. Beyond agriculture, the countryside also provided raw materials for the palace's industries. The surrounding hills held deposits of clay for pottery and construction. Streams yielded reeds for basketry and thatching. Timber from inland forests was in constant demand, both for building and for fueling the furnaces where bronze was cast. Some resources, such as copper and tin, the essential components of bronze, had to be imported, arriving at coastal landing points before making their way inland via well-worn paths. These paths were more than economic lifelines. They were arteries of communication and control. Messengers traveled them to carry orders and reports between the palace and outlying settlements. Traders moved along them with goods from other regions: amber from the north, glass beads from Egypt, fine ceramics from Crete. The villagers along these routes lived with a constant awareness that their lives were connected to a world far beyond their immediate horizons. Religion in the countryside mirrored and complemented the palace's official cults. Small rural shrines, sometimes nothing more than a stone altar in a grove or on a hilltop, dotted the landscape. Offerings here were modest: sheaves of grain, small vessels of oil, figurines shaped from clay, but they were no less heartfelt. These places often served as focal points for the community, blending practical needs like seasonal festivals with spiritual ones. While the palace presided over grander rituals, it did not attempt to suppress these local practices. Instead, it drew them into the wider religious calendar, reinforcing its role as the ultimate arbiter between people and gods. The relationship between the palace and the countryside was not without tension. In years of abundance, the system worked smoothly, with surplus flowing toward Nichoria and stability flowing back toward the villages. But in years of scarcity, when drought reduced the harvest or storms destroyed crops, the palace's demands could become a source of resentment. Farmers might hide part of their yield to feed their families, risking penalties. Disputes over grazing rights or water sources could flare into conflicts that required palace intervention. Such tensions, though often contained, were fissures in the seemingly solid structure of Mycenaean society. Seasonal rhythms shaped both work and leisure in the countryside. Spring was a time of planting and lambing, of repairing terraces and clearing irrigation channels. Summer brought the harvest of barley and wheat, followed by the threshing floors alive with the sound of flails and the smell of chaff in the air. Autumn was for pressing grapes and olives, for storing the year's bounty in clay jars sealed against pests and moisture. Winter, though milder than in northern lands, was a quieter season, with repairs to tools and dwellings, and the telling of stories by the hearth. Fairs and gatherings punctuated the agricultural year, often held at crossroads or near shrines. Here, villagers exchanged goods, news, and sometimes marriage arrangements. These events also provided the palace with opportunities to display its authority. An official might appear to announce new directives, resolve disputes, or collect overdue tribute. In this way, the social fabric of the countryside was continually woven and rewoven, with the palace's hand always visible in the pattern. To walk the land beyond Nichoria's walls was to encounter a mosaic of lives bound together by necessity and tradition. The palace depended on the countryside for its survival, but the countryside, in turn, relied on the palace for cohesion and defense. This balance was delicate. While the fields might seem eternal, their cultivation was the product of generations of human labor, guided and sometimes coerced by the needs of the elite. The surrounding territory also formed Nichoria's defensive perimeter. Watchtowers on hilltops provided early warning of approaching enemies. Coastal lookouts scanned the horizon for unfamiliar sails. Villagers might be called upon to contribute men to the palace's defense, serving as militia in times of threat. In exchange, the palace maintained fortifications and organized patrols to keep bandits and raiders at bay. This mutual reliance, as much as the exchange of goods, was the glue that held the system together. Archaeological surveys of the Nichoria region have revealed traces of this broader world. The foundations of farmhouses, the scatter of pottery shards along ancient paths, the outlines of terraces cut into the hillsides. These remnants are humble compared to the palace's ruins, but they speak volumes about the people who lived and worked here. Their lives, though less documented than those of the elite, were essential to the functioning of the Mycenaean order. Without them, the palace could not have stood for even a single generation. Yet the countryside, for all its productivity, was not immune to the forces that would bring down the palace. Environmental stress, shifting trade networks, political instability. These pressures were felt first in the villages, where margins were narrow and resilience tested daily. When the system began to fail, the signs would have appeared here before they reached the palace halls. The same paths that once carried tribute could carry rumors of unrest, or the first refugees from neighboring regions in turmoil. In this way, the land beyond the walls was both a source of strength and a harbinger of vulnerability. It was the mirror in which the palace could see its own reflection, thriving when the fields thrived, struggling when the fields faltered. And as the fortunes of Nichoria rose and fell, so too did those of the countless hands that tilled its soil, herded its flocks, and drew its lifeblood from the earth. For a kingdom tucked into the hills of Messenia, Nichoria's world was far larger than the horizon visible from its acropolis. Its identity was shaped not only by the land it ruled, but by the sea that lay to the west, a restless, glittering expanse that connected the Mycenaean world to a vast network of cultures, goods, and ideas. Though Nichoria itself was not perched directly on the coast, it sat close enough to benefit from and influence the maritime arteries that pulsed through the late Bronze Age Aegean. The Ionian Sea was more than a boundary, it was a corridor. Mycenaean ships, sleek, long, and narrow, propelled by oars and sail, plied its waters, carrying cargoes as precious as they were varied. Timber from the slopes of distant mountains, copper from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Cornwall, fine cloth from the Levant, perfumed oils in alabaster jars, and the gleam of worked gold all passed along these routes. Nichoria, like other palatial centers, positioned itself as a node in this network, sending out its own exports, olive oil, wine, textiles, and crafted goods, while drawing in the resources that could not be found within its own domain. Trade in the Mycenaean world was not conducted by anonymous merchants in bustling marketplaces, but was often orchestrated through elite connections. The palace at Nichoria controlled not only production, but distribution. Its officials would have overseen contracts, secured safe passage for ships, and established reciprocal arrangements with other centers. Some goods traveled as diplomatic gifts, others as payment for military or political alliances. A shipment of oil might seal a peace agreement. A cargo of bronze weapons might fulfill a promise of aid. The sea, however, was both an opportunity and a threat. Pirates roamed the waters, sometimes independent, sometimes under the sponsorship of rival powers, seeking to intercept valuable cargo. Storms could arise with little warning, driving ships onto rocky coasts or scattering fleets into dangerous waters. For this reason, maritime knowledge was prized. Understanding the seasonal shifts of the trade winds, the hidden currents, and the safe harbors could mean the difference between profit and disaster. Archaeological finds from other Mycenaean sites illuminate the reach of this network. Pottery from the Peloponnese has been found as far away as the Nile Delta, while Cretan and Cycladic goods appear in the archaeological layers of mainland palaces. Though we cannot yet point to a specific ship from Nichoria, the uniformity of Mycenaean material culture suggests that its artisans were producing wares indistinguishable from those of its peers. A stirrup jar from Nichoria could carry oil to a Cretan harbor and be instantly recognizable as a high-quality product of the Mycenaean sphere. The port towns that served Nichoria were likely small but busy. Wooden piers extended into sheltered bays where ships could unload their cargoes. Warehouses lined the shore, storing goods until they could be transported inland by pack animals along the same well-worn roads that carried tribute from the countryside. Coastal watchtowers scanned the horizon, and messages could be relayed to the palace if trouble threatened. In times of war, these ports became strategic assets, allowing troops and supplies to be moved quickly along the coast. The exchange of goods was never purely economic. Ideas, beliefs, and artistic styles traveled along the same routes as copper and wine. A motif in pottery might echo Egyptian lotus flowers or Levantine palm fronds. A palace hymn might borrow rhythms from Minoan ritual. A new ship design might be adapted from techniques learned in distant harbors. The world of Nichoria was porous, its culture enriched by every contact. Yet dependence on maritime trade also carried risks. If the sea lanes were disrupted by war, piracy, or the collapse of an allied state, the flow of essential materials could be choked off. The tin needed for bronze was especially critical. Without it, weapons and tools would suffer in both quality and quantity. In such a scenario, a palace like Nichoria might be forced to rely more heavily on local resources, straining its agricultural base and pushing its craftsmen to improvise with inferior materials. The prestige of Nichoria's rulers was partly built on their ability to maintain these far-reaching connections. Hosting foreign envoys, displaying exotic goods in ceremonial contexts, and outfitting warriors with the best imported weapons all reinforced the image of a palace that was both powerful and cosmopolitan. To lose access to these markers of status would not only weaken the economy, but erode the ideological foundations of rule. In the broader Mycenaean world, the sea was also a theater of conflict. Naval engagements were brutal affairs, fought at close quarters with spears, arrows, and boarding parties. Control of a key harbor or sea route could decide the fate of a kingdom. Nichoria, though perhaps not a dominant naval power like Mycenae or Pylos, would have had to navigate this reality carefully, aligning itself with stronger allies, avoiding provocations that could draw the wrath of maritime powers, and ensuring that its own coastal facilities were defensible. Seasonal festivals and religious rites often reflected the importance of the sea. Offerings to Poseidon, master of the waters, would have been made both in coastal shrines and inland temples. These ceremonies sought safe voyages and abundant catches, but they also reaffirmed the community's connection to the broader seafaring world. Fishermen, traders, and sailors all shared in the sense that their fortunes were bound to the tides. From a vantage point in the palace, the rulers of Nichoria would have understood that their prosperity depended on the balance of three realms: the land that sustained them, the walls that protected them, and the sea that connected them. The sea was not under their direct control, but their policies, alliances, and investments could shape how it served them. Every amphora of oil shipped, every ingot of copper received, was a small victory in the ongoing effort to keep Nichoria tied into the web of late Bronze Age exchange. But history offers a cautionary undertone. Many of the disruptions that swept through the Aegean in the later Bronze Age had maritime origins. The so-called Sea Peoples, whose exact identity remains debated, are recorded in Egyptian sources as raiders and invaders who swept through coastal settlements, destabilizing kingdoms and choking trade. Whether they were a single people or a loose confederation, their impact was real. If such pressures reached the western Peloponnese, Nichoria would have been vulnerable. The very openness that allowed it to thrive in good times could become an entry point for disaster. Even in decline, the patterns of trade left their imprint. Sherds of imported pottery in later strata, occasional caches of foreign goods in abandoned rooms, and the enduring layout of roads and storage facilities all speak to a time when Nichoria's fortunes rose and fell with the ships that docked at its harbors. In the ebb and flow of the Aegean's commerce, the palace's fate was carried as surely as any cargo upon the tide. In the centuries that followed the Mycenaean collapse, the sea remained, but the network it had once sustained was fractured. Nichoria's harbors, if they still operated at all, served smaller communities with humbler ambitions. The great days of palace-led trade were gone, leaving behind little more than the outlines of piers buried under sand and the silent testimony of goods that had once crossed oceans to find their place in a hilltop stronghold. For now, though, in the era when the palace still stood and the sails still dotted the horizon, the people of Nichoria could look west and know that the world was wide, full of promise, peril, and possibility. The wind in the rigging was the same wind that carried their name to distant shores, binding them to a story that stretched far beyond their own walls. Religion at Nichoria did not live only in temples or on festival days. It soaked into the mortar of walls, threaded the fields with meaning, and shadowed every weighing of oil and tally of grain, because the Mycenaean world joined power to piety so tightly that to speak of one without the other is to misunderstand both. The palace crowned the hill like a secular sun, yet within its light moved altars and hearths whose flames asserted that human order mirrored a higher pattern, and if the Wanax governed the people, the gods governed him. In the Megaron, the central hearth was more than warmth. It was a pivot around which authority turned, the opening in the roof a deliberate mouth through which smoke braided skyward, carrying the trace of burnt thigh bones and libations to a listening realm. Linear B tablets across the Aegean list deities with a bureaucrat's precision. Potnia the Lady, Poseidon master of earth and sea, perhaps Dewia and Hera and Zeus by earlier names, place spirits and crafts gods and powers of wind and rain. And while Nichoria has not yielded a thick archive of such records, the uniform grammar of Mycenaean religion allows a cautious reconstruction. The same pantheon that haunted Pylos and Mycenae likely received gifts here, too, in scaled-down ceremonies that still bound the countryside to the cosmic. Clay figurines of women with raised arms, bulls in miniature, birds poised as messengers, such icons, common across Messenia, compress a ritual language into palm-sized statements, signaling petition and protection. In storerooms, the practical and the sacred touched edges. Jars sealed against pests bore sealings that were both security devices and ritual marks, because to stamp the palace's sign was to invoke the order it claimed to keep, and to measure grain before an altar was to concede that abundance flowed from the gods through the hands of their appointed stewards. Outside the walls, the landscape itself was a temple, its topography lifted into meaning by shrines on knolls, springs where garlands hung, stones darkened by olive oil pours, and wind-worn niches that guarded terracotta offerings. The countryside's calendar measured the year by what the gods were owed as surely as by the readiness of barley or the fattening of lambs. Festivals braided palace and village into a single fabric. The driving of firstborn animals through smoke, the procession with jars toward a courtyard altar, the rhythmic stamping of feet as a hymn unwound in a mode taught long ago in Crete or Knossos, and now Holy Messenian, a local dialect of devotion that still carried the cadence of sea-crossing memory. At the hill's crest, the Wanax presided visibly when the rite demanded spectacle, garlanded, perfumed, flanked by the Lawagidas and attendants bearing libation bowls and knives of ceremonial shine, and less visibly when the rite demanded quiet efficacy, a pre-dawn pour of wine at the hearth or a sealed prayer over a tablet that recorded not only numbers but obligations to the unseen. Potnia's realm, mistress of animals, fields, and perhaps the palace itself, hovered as a felt presence over weaving rooms and birthing beds. To invoke her was to ask for looms to run true, for flocks to yean safely, for children to cry lustily and live. Poseidon, whose authority in the Bronze Age ran not only across waves but under the land as the shaker of earth, received attention that was practical in a seismically twitching country. No mason set a cornerstone without glancing toward him, and no admiralty decision about a convoy left the courtyard without an offering, since a god who tilts the ground can also tilt the balance between safe voyage and ruin. The palace's artisans inscribed their craft with ritual frames, dye vats salved by drops of oil before a seasonal run, bronze furnaces fed a pinch of grain, drivers of oxen tapping horn with a twig dipped in wine before hitching, gestures that kept the boundary with ill luck secure. The dead, too, threaded the palace economy with invisible claims. Tombs along the approaches and on distant ridges received goods that echoed the living warehouses, small jars of oil, cups, blades, pins for garments. As if the redistribution system continued in a subtler register, With the Wanax's authority mirrored by ancestors whose favor was a credit line, the living dared not default. And in this economy of grace and gift, the palace's ideology found its most persuasive script. To obey the center was to align with the gods. To rebel was not mere crime but sacrilege. To hide a portion of barley from the tablet's tally was to snarl the cords binding heaven and field. Yet religion in Nichoria was not command alone. It soothed as well as disciplined. In drought years, priests carried images to springs to coax their flow. In the weeks of lambing, midwives muttered old invocations over damp wool and trembling knees. When a storm shredded roofs and flattened grain, the community met in the forecourt not only for allocation of timber and reed, but for collective speech toward the sky, placing fear inside a form that made it shareable. Foreign contact salted the rites with variety. Traders from Crete, islanders from the Cyclades, messengers from Pylos, each brought small shifts in gesture and words, and the palace, keen to signal cosmopolitan reach, let certain fashions in: a lotus stamped on a vessel used in a feast, a bovine horn set above a doorpost, a pattern of steps for a processional that traced a labyrinthine memory. The gods did not seem to mind borrowings. Power honors itself wherever it finds an image adequate to its dignity. Even so, the rituals of Nichoria wore a distinctly local face in the cutting of animals raised on its hills, the pouring of oil pressed from its groves, the singing that bent to the shapes of its language, the pacing of its courtyards under its own stars. The palace's sacred rooms compressed the world into manageable rooms of awe, a small cella with a bench for offerings and a low table for figurines, a niche blackened by centuries of lamp smoke. A chest with votive pins and faience beads rubbed by fingers until their shine dulled into comfort. A courtyard altar whose ash rose by imperceptible grains into a tell of belief layered upon belief. If there were oracles, they were modest: dream incubation in a side chamber, casting of lots with knucklebones, observation of bird flight off the western ridge, and their counsel braided into the sober counsel of scribes and captains in the same day. Because Bronze Age prudence knew that certainty can be purchased by weight in arguments and purchased again by weight in incense. Children learned their place in this world by watching, then imitating. How to carry a small jug in a procession without spilling. How to set a sprig of myrtle just so on a threshold. How to place the first fruits on the storeroom sill before they joined the tally within. Each small act a thread that knotted identity to place. These rites, like language and law, train memory to run in grooves the palace chose. Yet religious life also revealed hairline cracks long before the walls themselves split. When the climate tightened its belt and the olive harvest failed twice in a row, the bells on cattle sounded thinner, and supplications multiplied. When a tremor rattled jars off their shelves and fissures crept like black lightning across plaster, the shaker's favor felt uncertain even after rich thigh bones smoked on the altar. When ships from the north failed to appear on schedule and rumors drifted in at fairs. Of burned granaries, of raiders with strange hair, of a great city where scribes fled with tablets clutched to their chests. The courtyard ceremonies grew more fervent and more anxious, a doubled devotion that sometimes shades into worry's shadow. In such seasons the palace may have increased sacrificial spectacle to steady nerves, and perhaps for a year it worked, pomp as a seawall against fear, but the gods to whom administrators appealed also governed rain, fault, and the resolve of distant enemies, and rituals cannot outvote their decisions. Still, piety left the most durable map of Nichoria's heart. Long after roofs fell and ash settled, archaeologists could read the site's inner weather by where smoke had stained stones, where votives clustered, where floors were smoothed by ritual feet. Soil chemistry traced libation spillage. Charred bones spoke the species and cuts that honored feasts. Microscopic pollen in plaster offered a floral ghost of garlands once hung. And the distribution of figurines sketched a domestic pantheon carried from room to room as families sought protection under a collapsing sky. Some in later ages would claim prophetic memory, telling of a night when flames crowned the hill and the gods withdrew their favor in a wind that tasted of brine and ash. But whether such stories preserve fact or console loss, only the earth knows. This information has not been verified. What stands clear is that religion at Nichoria bound people to each other, to their rulers, to their fields, and to horizons they could not command, and that as long as the sacred calendar turned, the palace could tell itself it stood inside a pattern more durable than stone. In that confidence lay strength, and a kind of blindness, because the very rites that steadied a society can become the music that drowns the first alarms. Soon the gods of hill and hearth would be asked to answer harder petitions, not merely for rain or safe voyage, but for the endurance of a world whose trade routes frayed, whose rivals grew hungry, whose ground shook under the feet of men who still lit incense and counted jars and believed that smoke rising straight meant stability. The next chapter will step from altar to threshold and scan the horizon for those omens of strain, where policy tightens, stores are rearranged, and a vigilant palace begins to feel the faint, cold draft that precedes a door blown open by forces no right can wholly placate. From the high ridge of Nichoria, the view stretched far enough to lull even the most watchful heart. To the west, the Ionian Sea lay in its shifting moods, glassy and blue on windless days, dark and broken when the squalls marched up from Africa. To the east, low hills folded into one another, their olive groves stippling the slopes like the patterned weave of a robe. In the middle years of the palace's reign, such a view could seem a guarantee. As long as the horizon remained familiar, so too would the rhythm of tribute, harvest, and festival. But horizons, like seas, are deceptive. Long before the storm breaks on the shore, the air changes. The elders of Nichoria, who remembered other years and other rulers, could feel it. A faint tension in the wind, a strangeness in the stories carried by traders from beyond Messenia's borders. The Mycenaean world was not a self-contained garden. It was a network of harbors, overland routes, and alliances that bound places as far apart as Thebes, Knossos, Troy, and the ports of Cyprus. Nichoria was no major hub, but it was a listening post, its palatial scribes trained to notice shifts in the flow of goods and news. The first whispers came from the north, a shortage of tin in the markets of Mycenae, a delay in the arrival of Cretan wine amphorae, an unseasonable quiet in the harbors of Pylos. None of these in isolation would trouble the Wanax's council. Tin could be sourced elsewhere. Wine shipments sometimes failed. Pylos had its own reasons for silence. But together, over the course of months, these signs accumulated like the first cloud banks far out to sea, visible to those who scanned the horizon daily, invisible to those who saw only the hilltop's comfort. Archaeologists today, piecing together pottery sherds and distribution maps, can read the faintest shadows of that change. Fewer imported luxury wares in the upper storerooms, more reliance on local production. A shift in the linear B tallies towards smaller, more cautious allocations hints that the palace was tightening its grip, perhaps preparing for leaner seasons. In an economy that balanced on the predictability of surplus, even a small disruption could feel like a warning tremor beneath the feet. Yet the palace's public face betrayed none of this caution. Ceremonies continued in the Megaron. Feasts were held in the courtyard. Gifts still moved outward to allies, if in slightly smaller measures. To admit to anxiety would be to risk the appearance of weakness, and weakness was a scent that traveled quickly in the Bronze Age. The storms in question were not only economic. Weather, too, was shifting. Sediment cores from Mycenaean lakes suggest that the late 13th century BCE saw intervals of drought, enough to stress the olive and barley crops. In a subsistence landscape, a bad harvest could be bridged with stores. 2 in a row would test even a well-managed palace. On the hill of Nichoria, such stresses would first be felt not in the Wanax's table, but in the outlying villages, where jars emptied sooner and the lean months stretched longer. Discontent in the countryside was dangerous. It could erode loyalty to the palace and invite opportunists from beyond its territory to meddle. It was in such moments that the council likely called for a re-evaluation of its defenses. Nichoria was no massive fortress like Tiryns, but its elevated position and thick walls gave it a measure of security. Watch rotations may have been lengthened, and messengers sent to check on garrisons along the coast. The palace's military arm, the Lawagidas and his warriors, began drilling more openly in the forecourt, their clatter a reminder to visitors that Nichoria's reach extended beyond trade and ritual. These displays were as much psychological as practical, a A storm on the horizon could be deterred, sometimes, if those in its path stood visibly ready. Trade partners, however, were less easily reassured. A convoy from the north arrived with fewer ships and more guarded speech. They spoke of trouble in the Hellespont, of raiders with strange accents and ships that could outpace the best Mycenaean galleys. In the eastern ports, Egyptian scribes were recording the first encounters with peoples they called sea peoples, though their names, Sherdin, Shikalesh, Peleset, would have meant little to Nichoria at the time. What mattered was the rumor that these newcomers did not come to trade but to take, and that they left fire in their wake. In the palace's archives, had they survived, we might have read how the Wanaks weighed these reports. Were they distant troubles, like thunder heard far out over the water, or omens that demanded immediate response? The conservative choice would be to shore up the existing system, secure storehouses, reinforce alliances, keep the sacred calendar running as proof that order still held. But the more daring mind might have considered preemptive moves, new trade routes, fresh defenses, tighter control over the countryside's production. Either way, the decisions made in these years would shape how Nichoria met the coming decade. For the common people, the whisper of storms took subtler forms. A traveling peddler might arrive with fewer foreign trinkets and more practical goods. A coastal cousin might send word of a village abandoned after a raid. A feast might serve more lentils and fewer cuts of meat. In the weaving rooms, foreign dyes became scarce. Local colors dominated the looms. These were the small indicators that daily life was adjusting, inch by inch, to conditions not yet called crisis, but leaning in that direction. Nature, too, contributed to the unease. A tremor one summer rattled the Megaron's columns, leaving hairline cracks in the plaster that the masons hastened to smooth. The priestesses offered wine and barley to Poseidon the earth-shaker, hoping to steady his mood. Seers were consulted more often. The flights of birds and the behavior of sacrificial animals took on greater weight. To live in the Bronze Age was to accept that the boundary between the mundane and the divine was porous, and that storms, whether of wind, politics, or the spirit, could be read in multiple languages. Even as these signs gathered, the palace sought to project stability. Delegations from Nichoria attended ceremonies at Pylos, exchanged gifts with neighboring hilltop towns, and welcomed traders from Crete. Each transaction, each public feast, was a reaffirmation of status, an act of saying, "We are here, we are strong, the gods favor us still." But in the quieter corners of the storerooms, in the guarded conversations between the Wanaks and his scribes, the question lingered, how long could that be said without strain? Modern historians caution against reading inevitability into these years. The Mycenaean world had weathered disruptions before. Nichoria had likely seen lean seasons, raids, and trade lulls in its history. But in hindsight, the late 13th century's converging pressures, economic, environmental, political, were of a different magnitude. The whisper of distant storms was no longer faint. It was becoming a steady undertone, audible to those willing to listen. In the next chapter, we will see how Nichoria's leaders attempted to hold the line, strengthening ties, reinforcing traditions, and perhaps over-relying on the very systems that would prove brittle under greater strain. For now, the hill above the sea still stood serene, its palace white in the sun, the Megaron hearth still burning, the gods still honored. But the wind had shifted, and those who lived by the horizon knew that once the air changes, the sea will follow. The palace at Nichoria, like the olive trees that clung to the stony hillsides, had been built to endure. Its foundations were set deep in bedrock. Its walls, thick with stone and mud brick, had withstood seasons of sun and rain, tremor and wind. Yet the true strength of a Mycenaean stronghold was not measured only in stone. It lay in the network of human bonds that tied it to the villages below, to the neighboring hill forts, and to the greater web of the Aegean world. By the middle years of the late 13th century BCE, as the whisper of distant storms grew more insistent, the rulers of Nichoria faced the challenge of reinforcing those bonds while masking the hairline cracks that threatened them. The first task was internal stability. A palace's authority depended on the confidence of its people, and that confidence was nourished by routine, by the unbroken rhythm of festivals, sacrifices, and administrative cycles. The Megaron still hosted the great seasonal feasts, where wine flowed and roasted meats filled the air with their scent, and where the Wanax presided in ceremonial robes, ringed by his retainers. The temples were adorned with fresh offerings. Libations poured to Poseidon for calm seas, garlands hung for Athena to bless the artisans, and sacrifices made to the Wanax's household gods to guard against famine. The message was clear. The palace stood firm, the gods were pleased, and the land was in capable hands. Behind these public displays, however, there was a tightening of control. Linear B tablets from other Mycenaean sites, close analogs to what must have existed at Nichoria, show shifts in how rations were distributed and labor was assigned during times of stress. Farmers may have been required to deliver a larger share of their grain to palace granaries, with fewer exemptions for poor harvests. Craftsmen producing textiles and bronze weapons might have found themselves working longer hours to fulfill palace quotas, their goods earmarked for trade missions meant to shore up distant alliances. The redistribution of resources was both a survival strategy and a risk. Squeezed too hard, and resentment could spread among the very people whose loyalty was needed most. Externally, diplomacy became the shield and spear of Nichoria's defense. Messengers were dispatched to Pylos with gifts of fine oil and wool, reaffirming the subordinate alliance that tied Nichoria to the more powerful palace on the coast. Delegations may have traveled to Messenia's inland hill towns, securing promises of mutual defense against raiders. Envoys were sent across the narrow seas to Crete and perhaps as far as the Cyclades, not only to trade but to listen, to gather intelligence about the currents of conflict, migration, and opportunity rippling through the Aegean. In these journeys, the palace invested heavily in appearances. The emissaries carried well-crafted goods, wore their finest tunics, and spoke of Nichoria as a stable partner even as its rulers privately measured the depth of their granaries and the reliability of their guards. Military readiness was quietly increased. The Loagidas, commander of the warrior class, organized more frequent drills in the courtyard, where young men practiced with spears and javelins under the watch of older veterans. Patrols along the coast were doubled, especially at the mouths of rivers where raiders might beach their ships. In the villages, headmen were encouraged to maintain their own watch rotations, a reminder that defense began at the local level. Weapons production may have seen a shift from ceremonial to practical. Less ornate hilts, more emphasis on blades that could withstand repeated use. The palace also sought to hold the line economically by adapting its trade strategy. With imported luxuries less reliable, Nichoria leaned on its strengths: olive oil, wool, and finely made pottery. Oil was pressed from the groves that spread across the lower slopes, stored in great pit-hoy sealed with clay stoppers, and shipped in sturdy amphorae. Wool from the palace's flocks was spun and dyed in workshops that still hummed with activity, the colors drawn from local plants when foreign dyes ran short. Pottery kilns turned out vessels both for domestic use and for trade, their designs bearing the distinctive patterns of Messenia. These goods became not only a source of income but a statement of resilience, proof that Nichoria could produce, could trade, and could meet its obligations despite shifting tides. Yet there was no escaping the subtle signs of strain. Traders who once lingered for days in Nichoria's market now moved on quickly, their routes shortened to save time and risk. The gossip they carried spoke of burned settlements on distant coasts, of ports where foreign ships loomed on the horizon, of men who claimed no home but the deck of a vessel. The sea peoples, though not yet a clear and present danger to Messenia, had become a recurring shadow in conversation, a rumor given shape by too many similar stories from too many directions. Religious ritual took on new urgency in this climate. Offerings grew more lavish, as if to secure divine favor through sheer abundance. Diviners were consulted more frequently. Dreams were recorded and interpreted. In the palace courtyard, processions wound their way to the altar, the people singing hymns older than the palace itself. Such acts were both spiritual appeals and political theater, reinforcing the idea that the rulers of Nichoria were the chosen intermediaries between mortals and gods. Archaeologists looking back at this period can read these patterns in the fragments. A sudden concentration of storage vessels in certain rooms, suggesting centralization of supplies. an uptick in weapons and armor found in what might have been administrative contexts, shifts in ceramic styles that hint at localized production. Each shard, each architectural change, speaks to a community balancing between caution and continuity, between the need to adapt and the desire to maintain the world as it had always been. By holding the line, by doubling down on tradition, alliance, and preparedness, Nichoria's leaders bought time. Time to harvest another crop, to complete another trade mission, to hope that the storms breaking elsewhere would exhaust themselves before reaching Messenia. But such a strategy carried its own danger. It assumed that the systems which had sustained the palace for generations could withstand whatever came next. History, and the ruins that remain, suggest that the storms would not be so easily deflected. The hill above the sea still looked out on a landscape of sunlit groves and calm water. Yet beneath that surface calm, the palace was bracing itself. It was a quiet kind of tension, the sort that presses into the fabric of daily life without ever declaring itself openly. And in that quiet, Nichoria prepared for the test it could feel but not yet see. The test that would determine whether its walls, its alliances, and its people could weather what the Aegean world was becoming. The year that broke Nichoria did not begin with fire or steel. It began, as most years did, with the winter rains soaking the hillsides, turning the olive groves dark and gleaming, and filling the cisterns. The fields below the palace lay in a patchwork of wet furrows, ready to receive the first seeds of barley and wheat. From the Megaron, the Wanax looked out upon a scene that seemed as timeless as the hills themselves, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that the threads holding this order together had already begun to fray beyond repair. The signs were subtle at first, scattered and easy to dismiss. A trader from Crete arrived weeks later than expected, his cargo of copper ingots reduced to a handful. He spoke of unrest in the ports, of harbors choked with ships that were not merchants but armed raiders, their sails marked with unfamiliar emblems. A coastal village reported the loss of several fishing boats in a single night. Whether to theft, storm, or some darker cause was uncertain. Even the inland routes, once dependable arteries of trade and tribute, carried strange news. Settlements abandoned, storehouses stripped bare, roads eerily quiet. Inside the palace, the linear B scribes recorded shifts that no one could ignore. Grain deliveries dropped below the quotas set by the previous harvest. The stock of bronze, already diminished by interrupted trade with Cyprus, was stretched thin to meet both the needs of the warriors and the demands of palace workshops. Pottery production slowed as fuel for the kilns became harder to secure. And perhaps most troubling of all, the once steady flow of oil from the groves faltered, a sign that either the trees themselves were suffering from neglect or the laborers were no longer working the fields as they should. There is a point in every collapse when the leadership must choose between acknowledging the scale of the crisis or clinging to the illusion of control. In Nichoria, the choice was to project strength. The great feasts went ahead as planned, the wine watered just enough to stretch the supply, the meats carved into smaller portions but still served on gleaming platters. The Wanax received visiting envoys with the same warmth as before, though behind the polished courtesy lay an urgency to secure pledges of mutual aid. Yet the mass began to slip in the quieter corners of the palace. The guards spoke in hushed tones of pay withheld, the artisans whispered of tools left unrepaired, and the servants noticed how often the storerooms were visited by high-ranking officials checking inventories. Beyond the palace walls, the anxiety was harder to contain. Farmers who had seen their fields raided by unknown men were reluctant to plant again without protection. Shepherds moved their flocks higher into the hills, away from the main roads, which meant the palace had to send messengers farther afield to collect wool and meat. Villages that had once been quick to answer the palace's call for labor now sent only a fraction of the men requested, citing sickness or urgent work at home. The bonds that tied the countryside to Nichoria were loosening, one frayed thread at a time. It was in this atmosphere of strain that the blow finally fell. No record survives to tell exactly what form it took, whether it was a coordinated raid, an attack by sea, or a wave of refugees turned desperate by hunger, but the archaeological remains point to sudden and violent destruction. In one section of the palace, a thick layer of ash still clings to the stones, mixed with fragments of charred timber that once supported the roof. Storage rooms bear the marks of intense heat, their clay pithoi cracked and collapsed, the grain inside reduced to carbonized husks. In the megaron itself, the floor is littered with the debris of collapsed walls, and the once proud hearth lies choked with rubble. The fire may have raged for hours, perhaps through the night. In the darkness, the sound of shouting would have echoed off the walls, mingling with the crash of falling beams and the crackle of flames consuming painted plaster. Smoke would have poured through the palace's narrow corridors, driving its inhabitants into the open, where the attackers, if attackers there were, could finish their work. The thick timbers that supported the roof over the megaron burned hot enough to leave their imprint in the layer of soil that archaeologists uncovered millennia later. When the flames finally died, Nichoria was no longer a palace. The administrative heart of the region lay in ruins, its granaries gutted, its archives destroyed. Those who survived faced a choice: rebuild or abandon. The evidence suggests they chose a third path, a partial reoccupation of the site, on a much smaller scale. The grandeur of the Mycenaean palace was gone, replaced by simpler structures, more village than citadel. The central authority that had once coordinated the region's resources was broken, and with it the network of obligations and protections that had defined life in Nichoria for generations. What happened next fits the broader pattern of the late Bronze Age collapse. Across the Aegean and beyond, other palaces burned. Pylus, Mycenae, Tiryns, and trade networks dissolved into isolated pockets of local exchange. The great kingdoms of the Near East reeled under the same pressures: drought, migration, warfare, and the cascading failures of systems too interconnected to survive the loss of key nodes. For Nichoria, the breaking point had come swiftly and decisively, leaving no room for the slow decline that might have allowed adaptation. And yet, even in its shattered state, the site remained a place where people lived. The survivors adapted to a world where long-distance trade was unreliable, where the authority of kings had been replaced by local chieftains or councils, where survival depended less on the prestige of a palace and more on the resilience of small communities. The hill above the sea still offered a defensible position, access to arable land, and a view of the routes that might one day carry opportunity again. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the palace faded, its stones repurposed for humbler buildings, its name lost to time. But the breaking point, the moment when fire and chaos ended the old order, was etched into the very soil. To walk the site today is to tread upon that silent testimony, to feel the gap between what once was and what could no longer be. Nichoria's fall was both an ending and a beginning, a transformation forced by forces too great to resist, yet met with the stubborn will to endure in whatever form was possible. The smoke that had risen from Nichoria's hilltop lingered in the valleys for days, a gray reminder of the night the palace fell. By the time the last embers cooled, the air carried the scent of ash and damp earth rather than the fragrant oils and roasted meats that once perfumed the megaron. The grandeur was gone. No more processions of robed officials, no more scribes bending over fresh linear B tablets in flickering lamplight, no more storerooms stacked to their vaulted ceilings with the wealth of the surrounding countryside. And yet, even in the wreckage, life refused to retreat entirely. The survivors, those who had fled into the hills during the attack, those who had hidden in cellars, those who had returned from distant fields to find nothing left, began the slow work of shaping a new existence from the ruins. The first days after the fire were devoted to necessities. Clearing debris from what could be salvaged, retrieving any unburned grain from shattered pithoi, gathering timber from collapsed roofs to repurpose for shelter. The palace's commanding presence had been reduced to a hollowed shell, but its stone foundations remained, solid enough to serve as the base for more modest structures. In places where the walls had collapsed, the survivors built smaller dwellings, their mud brick walls rising where grand corridors had once stood. What had been a central administrative complex began to look more like a cluster of village houses, each with its own hearth, each occupied by families who now answered to no higher authority than their own needs. Without the palace's centralized bureaucracy, the careful redistribution of resources that had sustained the region ceased. There were no longer scribes to record the inflow of grain or the outflow of oil, no officials to enforce quotas or coordinate long-distance trade. In their place, local households began to store their own harvests, guard their own livestock, and manage their own exchanges with neighbors. This decentralization brought both freedom and vulnerability, freedom from palace demands, but vulnerability to shortages that could no longer be alleviated by centralized reserves. The loss of the palace also meant the loss of the craft specialization it had supported. The palace workshops that had produced fine textiles and intricate pottery for export were gone, their artisans scattered. Some craftsmen adapted, making simpler goods for local use. Clay jars without elaborate decoration, wool garments dyed in the earth tones that could be produced from local plants. Bronze work became rare, as the supply of imported copper and tin dwindled to a trickle. The objects of daily life grew plainer, more functional, reflecting the new reality in which survival took precedence over display. Religious life adapted as well. The grand ceremonies once held in the palace courtyard were no longer possible, but the gods were not abandoned. Shrines emerged in smaller, humbler forms, in a corner of a house, under a tree, on a stone outcrop overlooking the fields. Offerings were made not with lavish gold cups or imported incense, but with bread, olive oil, and flowers. Ritual became more intimate, woven into the fabric of daily labor rather than staged as public spectacle. The people still called on the same deities for protection, rain, and health, but the relationship between worshiper and God became less mediated by rulers and more rooted in the household. Archaeological evidence suggests that some parts of Nichoria were never reoccupied at all. The areas most heavily damaged by fire, or most closely associated with palace administration, were abandoned and left to weather back into the earth. In their place, new activity clustered around the edges of the old site, where access to water and arable land was easiest. This shift marks an important transformation. Nichoria ceased to be a hub for an interconnected political and economic system and became instead a small-scale agrarian settlement, one among many in the hills of Messenia. In this new order, leadership was no longer the prerogative of a single wanax, but of local elders or war leaders whose influence depended on personal reputation rather than hereditary office. Authority was fluid, rising and falling with a man's ability to protect his kin and manage resources. Disputes were settled within the community, alliances forged through marriage and mutual defense rather than royal decree. This form of governance was less stable but more responsive, adapting quickly to the shifting needs of small groups. The survivors of Nichoria carried with them the memory of the palace years, but memory can be both a burden and a guide. The knowledge of large-scale organization, advanced craftsmanship, and complex trade did not vanish overnight. It was preserved in fragments, in the skills of artisans, in the stories told to children about the days when the hilltop gleamed with painted walls and the Megaron's hearth burned bright. These memories became part of the community's identity, a reminder of what had been lost and perhaps, in some distant future, could be regained. The broader world, however, had changed. Across the Aegean, palaces lay in ruins, trade routes fractured, and the old order of the late Bronze Age had dissolved into a patchwork of isolated communities. In such an environment, survival depended on local resilience rather than regional coordination. Nichoria's position, overlooking fertile land and close enough to the coast for occasional contact, meant it could endure, but endurance now meant something different. It meant steady harvests, secure storage, strong family ties, and the ability to defend one's home without relying on distant allies. In time, vegetation reclaimed the scars of the fire. New houses rose among the ruins, their walls humbler, but their hearths warm. Children played in the shadows of stones that had once formed the palace walls, their games unaware of the grandeur their parents had seen fade. The rhythms of life, planting, harvest, marriage, birth, mourning, resumed their place, as they always had in the Mediterranean, where the land and the sea shape human destiny more than any palace ever could. Yet beneath this surface of continuity lay a quiet transformation. The fall of the palace had broken the hierarchical system that tied Nichoria to the great centers of Mycenaean power. In its place, a more fragmented but perhaps more adaptable society emerged. The people no longer looked to the Megaron for answers. they looked to each other. And in that shift, the community that rose from the ashes was both less and more than the one that had burned. A smaller, rougher, more self-reliant version of itself, rooted not in the grandeur of a central hall, but in the stubborn determination to live on in the land that had swallowed a palace. Generations after the palace of Nichoria had fallen, the hill still held a presence that could not be erased. Its stone foundations, though softened by time and covered in creeping vegetation, rose above the surrounding farmland like the bones of some long-dead giant. Shepherd boys would climb among the tumbled blocks in the golden light of late afternoon, their voices carrying across the valley as they called to their flocks. Farmers passing along the footpaths would glance upward, some with a nod of recognition, others with the superstitious caution reserved for places that carried a weight of history or a shadow of the divine. The ruin had become more than a relic. It was a landmark in both the physical and cultural landscape, a point around which stories gathered like leaves in a hidden eddy. Those stories were not a single, unified tale, but a web of shifting versions, adapted by each teller to the mood of the audience. In one version, the palace had been abandoned willingly when its ruler, warned by a dream from the gods, led his people away to escape a terrible curse. In another, it had been destroyed in a single night by raiders from across the sea, their ships vanishing into the dawn with all the palace's gold. Still others whispered that the palace had been swallowed by the earth itself as punishment for some unspoken sin, its treasures buried deep and guarded by restless spirits. In the absence of written records, these oral traditions filled the gap, blending scraps of truth with the fertile imagination of generations who had only the stones themselves as evidence. In the small settlements that dotted the surrounding hills, the memory of the palace years persisted in subtler ways. Certain family names were said to descend from palace scribes or guards. Certain fields were known by names that hinted at their former role in supplying the Megaron. Tools and ornaments handed down as heirlooms. Bronze knives, decorated spindle whorls, fragments of painted pottery, were displayed with pride and imbued with the authority of age. These objects carried their own silent testimony, linking the present to a past that, though fragmented, still resonated in the identities of those who remained. Seasonal rituals, too, bore traces of Mycenaean influence, even if their origins had been forgotten. At the onset of harvest, villagers would gather at a particular spring near the hill to pour libations of oil and wine into the water. The act, now explained as a gesture to ensure a good yield, echoed the offerings once made at palace shrines to secure divine favor. In the long evenings of winter, when work slowed and the hearth was the center of community life, elders would tell the stories of the great house on the hill, shaping its rise and fall into lessons about pride, fortune, and the fickle will of the gods. Over time, the ruins became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Travelers seeking guidance might climb the hill to leave a token, a sprig of olive, a shard of pottery, a few grains of barley, on the weathered stones. These gestures were not tied to any organized religion, but to the sense that the place itself, by virtue of its age and mystery, possessed a kind of power. Some came to ask for blessings on a journey or a marriage. Others came in mourning, perhaps hoping that the spirits of the past might intercede for the living. Even those who doubted such things would admit that the hill had an atmosphere unlike any other, a blend of openness and seclusion that invited reflection. Archaeological layers from this period tell a quiet but consistent story. The hilltop was never entirely abandoned. Modest dwellings, animal pens, and small storage pits appear intermittently in the record, suggesting that families continued to live in and around the ruins, adapting the old stones for new uses. Walls that once enclosed storerooms might now serve as the back wall of a cottage. A collapsed corridor could become a convenient path from one terrace to another. The grandeur was gone, but the site's utility, and its symbolic weight, remained. This blending of practicality and reverence is perhaps the most telling aspect of Nichoria's afterlife. The people who lived in its shadow neither froze the ruins in sacred untouchability nor erased them in pursuit of new construction. Instead, they wove them into the ongoing life of the community, allowing the hill to remain both a place of work and a place of memory. In doing so, they ensured that the echoes of the palace years did not fade into silence, but continued to resonate in daily rhythms and seasonal cycles. By the time iron tools began to appear in Messenia, bringing new efficiencies to farming and craftwork, the palace had been gone for centuries. And yet, the stories endured. The arrival of new technologies did not erase the old landmarks. Rather, they gave the hill a fresh context. Some storytellers wove the coming of iron into their narratives of the palace's fall, imagining that the gods had destroyed Nichoria to clear the way for a new age. Others saw the enduring ruins as proof that even the greatest powers could crumble, a warning to any who might grow too proud. What is most striking is how the meaning of the ruins evolved. For the Mycenaeans, the palace had been a center of administration, economy, and ritual. For the generations after its fall, it became a mirror for their own concerns, a symbol of loss, resilience, or divine will, depending on what was needed at the time. In this way, the echoes in the hills were never static. They shifted with the wind of human imagination, carrying forward the essence of Nichoria even as the details of its history blurred into legend. By the early 20th century, the hill that once held Nichoria's palace was little more than a rise in the Mycenaean landscape, grazed by goats, tufted with hardy shrubs, and crowned by scattered blocks of weathered limestone. To the local farmers, it was just another feature of the terrain, useful for grazing, awkward for plowing, perhaps a place to find the occasional ancient potsherd turned up by the plow. But to the trained eye of an archaeologist, such stones were not random debris. They were whispers from another age, fragments of a story waiting to be unearthed. It was the post-war decades, when Greece was reasserting its cultural identity after occupation and turmoil, that the first serious attention came to the site. The British and American schools of archaeology, which had long been fascinated by the Bronze Age civilizations of the Aegean, were already well established in Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns. The palace at Pylos, only a day's walk from Nichoria, had been excavated in 1939 by Carl Blegen, revealing its splendid frescoes and storerooms bursting with linear B tablets. In the wake of such discoveries, the quiet hill of Nichoria began to attract more than casual glances. The first surveys were modest affairs, a few days spent walking the site, mapping visible stones, and collecting surface finds. But even these preliminary efforts hinted at significance. Pottery fragments bore the unmistakable decoration of the late Helladic period. Architectural traces suggested substantial structures, and the strategic location, commanding the surrounding valleys, was exactly the kind that Mycenaean rulers favored for their centers. The hill's potential drew interest, but it would take years before a full excavation was organized. That moment came in the 1960s and 1970s, when a joint expedition led by American archaeologists undertook systematic excavation of Nichoria. With funding secured and a team assembled, the work began in earnest, clearing brush, setting up excavation grids, and carefully peeling back layers of soil that had accumulated over centuries. For the archaeologists, each shovelful of earth was both a destruction and a revelation, the irreversible removal of the past's protective covering and the unveiling of what lay beneath. The first trenches revealed walls built of rough stone foundations with mud brick superstructures, consistent with Mycenaean construction techniques. In some places, the foundations traced the outlines of rooms that could be identified by their contents: hearths for cooking, storage pits for grain, benches that might have served as workspaces. There were signs of a larger central structure, walls thicker than the rest, perhaps once supporting a roofed hall, but erosion and later habitation had obscured much of the plan. Still, the layout bore enough resemblance to other Mycenaean centers to suggest that this was indeed a palace or its close equivalent, commanding the surrounding region in the centuries before its destruction. Among the most tantalizing finds were the small, humble artifacts that hinted at daily life. Spindle whorls worn smooth by repeated use, bronze pins that once fastened garments, fragments of fine-painted pottery whose motifs echoed the designs of more famous sites. These were not treasures in the sense of gold or jewels, but they were treasures of another kind, material proof of the human hands that had worked, eaten, loved, and died in this place. The excavation also uncovered layers of destruction. Burned clay from collapsed walls, charred seeds from storerooms, and cracked roof tiles spoke of a fire intense enough to bring the structure down. In the debris, the archaeologists found no large-scale rebuilding, no evidence of a swift recovery. Instead, above the destruction layer lay the remains of simpler buildings, smaller, rougher, less centralized. It was the material record of the transition from a palace-centered society to a more dispersed, village-based life. Even more intriguing were the burials. A small number of graves from the post-palatial period were found on the site, their contents modest but telling. Simple pottery offerings, bronze knives, and in one case, a bead of imported faience, a remnant of the far-reaching trade networks that had once enriched the region. The presence of these graves suggested that, even after the palace was gone, the hill retained a special significance, perhaps as a place where ancestral authority still resonated. The archaeologists' work was painstaking and slow. Every artifact was recorded, every soil change noted, every stone wall photographed from multiple angles. But the excitement was palpable, for each discovery added another piece to the puzzle of Nichoria's history. Gradually, a picture emerged. A thriving Mycenaean center that rose to regional prominence, suffered destruction in the great upheavals of the late Bronze Age collapse, and persisted as a smaller settlement for centuries afterward. Yet gaps remained, as they always do in archaeology. No linear B tablets were found at Nichoria, depriving historians of the written records that had illuminated life at Pylos. The exact cause of the palace's destruction remained uncertain. Was it invasion, internal conflict, natural disaster, or some combination? Without conclusive evidence, the archaeologists were forced to weigh probabilities, comparing the site's timeline to broader patterns across the Aegean. By the time the excavations concluded, Nichoria had joined the ranks of significant Mycenaean sites, its findings published in detailed reports that became essential reading for scholars of the late Bronze Age. But for all the clarity the spade had brought, it also deepened the mystery. The artifacts and architecture confirmed that a palace had stood here, and that it had fallen, but they could not fully capture the human drama, the hopes, fears, and choices that lay behind those events. And so the hill remained, its stones once again exposed to the sun and rain, but now marked by the footprints of two civilizations, the Mycenaean world that had built and lost it, and the modern one that had sought to recover its story. The echoes in the hills had been given a new voice, one shaped not by legend alone, but by the careful, methodical work of those who believe that the past, once uncovered, can still speak to the present. To reconstruct the world of Nichoria in its prime is to walk a delicate line between evidence and imagination. The archaeologist's spade provides the foundation, measurements of walls, patterns of post holes, scatters of pottery, but the living picture must be built from analogy, comparison, and careful inference. Nichoria, like other Mycenaean centers, was part of a complex tapestry of power, economy, and belief that bound together the late Bronze Age Aegean. Understanding it means not only looking at what was found on the hill, but also what is known from the greater Mycenaean sphere. The palace itself, though far less grand than Mycenae or Tiryns, would have been the administrative and symbolic heart of the region. Its megaron, the central hall that formed the architectural and political nucleus, likely featured a large hearth, surrounded by painted plaster walls. Fresco fragments from nearby sites suggest vivid scenes of warriors, chariots, processions, and geometric patterns in red, black, and ochre. While none of these decorations survived at Nichoria, the proportions of its surviving walls make it plausible that such imagery once set the tone for audiences received within. The megaron's roof, supported by stout wooden columns, would have risen above a floor of packed clay or perhaps gypsum slabs, polished to a soft sheen. From this hall, the local ruler, known in the linear B tablets of other palaces as a wanax, would have directed the activities of his domain. Agricultural produce flowed in from the surrounding villages. Jars of olive oil, amphorae of wine, sacks of barley and wheat, honey in ceramic vessels sealed with clay stoppers. Livestock, too, was part of the palace economy. Herds of sheep and goats for wool, cattle for meat and plowing. Nichoria's position in Messenia placed it near fertile plains, wooded uplands, and coastal access, a combination that supported both subsistence and trade. The palace's storerooms, inferred from the remains of thick-walled rooms with bench-like shelves, would have been filled with pithoi, massive clay jars that could hold hundreds of liters of grain or liquid. Such storage was not merely practical, it was a means of power. By controlling surplus, the ruler could redistribute goods in times of shortage, reward loyal followers, and support specialized laborers who did not work the fields. Artisans, potters, metalworkers, weavers, likely lived close to the palace, their skills honed for both local needs and prestige goods destined for trade. Trade itself tied Nichoria into a web that extended far beyond Messenia. Even in the limited finds from the site, there are hints of contact. A bead of faience, almost certainly imported from Egypt or the Levant, pottery styles that echo Cretan designs. Obsidian from the island of Melos. In the late Bronze Age, the Aegean was a sea of connections, and Nichoria, though modest compared to the great palaces, was part of that network. Ships from Pylos might have called here, carrying cargoes to and from more distant harbors, while overland routes linked the hill to markets and allies inland. Daily life in Nichoria would have been shaped by the rhythms of the agricultural year. In spring, fields were plowed and planted. In summer, flocks were moved to higher pastures. In autumn, the grain and olives were harvested. In winter, work turned inward, repairing tools, weaving textiles, and maintaining the palace stores. Religious observance punctuated these cycles. The Mycenaean pantheon, already containing early forms of later Greek gods, demanded offerings of wine, oil, and animals. Shrines, whether within the palace or in the countryside, would have been sites of both solemn ritual and communal celebration. The people themselves were stratified but interconnected. At the top stood the Wanax and his immediate household, surrounded by officials, record keepers, overseers, military leaders. Beneath them, free farmers and herders formed the bulk of the population, providing labor, goods, and military service when required. Slaves, whether born into bondage or captured in war, worked in both domestic and agricultural roles. While the hierarchy was clear, the palace economy relied on cooperation. Without the steady flow of goods from the countryside, the ruler's authority could not be sustained. One can imagine the bustle of the hill in its prime. Artisans hammering bronze into spearheads, women spinning and dyeing wool in courtyard workshops, scribes pressing stylus into wet clay tablets, guards patrolling the perimeter, and runners carrying messages along the ridge paths to neighboring settlements. The sounds would have been a mixture of human activity and the natural world. Goats bleating, oxen lowing, the distant crash of waves when the wind shifted from the sea. To stand on the hill today and imagine such life requires a conscious act of layering. The stones become walls, the gaps become doorways, the emptiness fills with the presence of people long gone. Archaeology gives the outlines, historical imagination gives the color. This reconstruction is not fantasy, but an informed hypothesis, built from patterns observed across Mycenaean Greece. Nichoria's specific details may have differed, but its role in the larger system was clear. It was a local hub of authority, economy, and identity in the centuries before the late Bronze Age collapse. And yet, in reconstructing this world, the seeds of its downfall are also visible. The same networks that brought wealth also brought vulnerability, raiders, rivalries, and the disruptive ripple effects of distant conflicts. The palace's centralization of resources, while powerful, made it dependent on stability. Any sustained disruption could undermine the entire system. In the next chapter, the forces that unraveled Nichoria's world will come into focus, showing how a thriving center could, within a generation, become a ruin on a hill. By the twilight years of the 13th century BCE, the Mycenaean world was already showing signs of strain. Across the Aegean and beyond, the intricate web of trade, diplomacy, and shared culture that had bound palace societies together for centuries began to fray. The reasons remain the subject of fierce scholarly debate. Some point to natural disasters, others to the movements of hostile peoples across the Mediterranean, still others to internal social tensions or the gradual erosion of central authority. Whatever the combination of causes, the result was a slow but inexorable unraveling. Nichoria, though smaller than the great capitals, was not spared. In the archaeological record, The change is visible first as a thinning of the material culture. Imported goods become rarer, replaced by locally produced wares of simpler form. Pottery styles lose some of their refinement. Metal objects, once common in the form of weapons and decorative pins, become scarcer. These changes suggest a contraction of long-distance trade and a turn inward towards self-sufficiency. The faience beads, fine stirrup jars, and exotic motifs of earlier decades give way to plainer, more utilitarian artifacts. For a center like Nichoria, so dependent on its ties to Pylos and the broader Mycenaean network, this was more than an aesthetic shift, it was an early warning of isolation. The geopolitical context may have been equally dangerous. If Pylos itself faced pressure, whether from seaborne raiders, rival powers in the Peloponnese, or discontent among its own subjects, then its satellites like Nichoria would be vulnerable. Military readiness would have been paramount, yet the resources to maintain strong defenses may have dwindled. A small garrison on the hill, armed with aging weapons and short on supplies, could not hold out indefinitely against determined assault. Climatic instability may also have played a role. Paleoclimate studies from the eastern Mediterranean suggest episodes of drought in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. For an agricultural society, even a few failed harvests could be catastrophic, undermining the palace's ability to store and redistribute grain. In such conditions, the bonds between ruler and subject might weaken as survival became a more pressing concern than loyalty to a distant authority. The palace economy, so efficient in good times, could be brittle under stress. Without a steady influx of goods from surrounding villages, storerooms emptied, workshops fell silent, and the ruling elite lost both the means and the legitimacy to govern. Discontent might have simmered into open defiance. Rival factions could have contested control of the hill. If outside forces, whether seaborne invaders or land-based enemies, struck during such a moment of weakness, the result could be swift and decisive. Archaeological evidence points to a violent end for the Mycenaean phase of Nichoria. In the destruction layer, charred timbers lie where they fell, burned clay preserves the ghostly imprint of vanished walls, and pottery is found smashed in place, as if dropped in haste. The pattern suggests fire intense enough to collapse the mud-brick superstructure, consuming roof beams and leaving little salvageable material behind. In some rooms, the debris appears undisturbed, hinting that survivors either could not or would not return to reclaim what was lost. The absence of mass graves or obvious human remains in the destruction layer leaves open questions. Did the inhabitants flee in time, escaping into the hills or to allied settlements? Were they captured or killed elsewhere? Without written records from Nichoria itself, these possibilities remain unverified, shadows in the historical imagination. What is certain is that the palace as a political and economic institution ceased to function. In the years following the destruction, the site was reoccupied, but not rebuilt to its former scale. The grand central hall was abandoned. Instead, smaller, simpler houses were erected amid the ruins. The layout became irregular, reflecting the needs of individual households rather than the integrated plan of a palace complex. Storage shifted from communal pithoi to smaller jars and baskets. Tools were fashioned from whatever materials were at hand. The people of post-palatial Nichoria lived in a humbler, more localized world, where survival depended on family labor and close ties to nearby communities rather than on the distant reach of a Wanax. This transformation was not unique to Nichoria. Across the Mycenaean world, palaces fell and smaller settlements emerged in their place. The collapse was systemic, marking the end of the Late Bronze Age in Greece and ushering in a period sometimes called the Greek Dark Age. A term that reflects the loss of monumental architecture, centralized administration, and, perhaps most critically, literacy. The linear B script used in palace archives disappeared, taking with it a rich record of names, transactions, and official decrees. Without writing, the people of Nichoria entered a long era in which their history would be preserved only through oral tradition and the mute testimony of the land. The hill itself, stripped of its former splendor, remained a home to those who chose or were forced to stay. Fields were still tilled, flocks still grazed, and life went on, but the sense of being part of a great, interconnected civilization was gone. What had once been a node in a vast network became a small, self-reliant village, its people perhaps dimly aware that they were living among the bones of a vanished order. In the centuries to come, new cultures would rise and fall, and the memory of the palace would fade into the realm of legend, if it was remembered at all. Yet, even in its reduced state, Nichoria persisted, bearing silent witness to the cycles of ambition, glory, and decline that shape human history. The next chapter will explore this afterlife, tracing how the ruins endured through centuries of obscurity before their rediscovery in the modern age. Long after the flames of the palace died down and the Mycenaean world receded into memory, Nichoria remained, no longer a beacon of regional power, but a modest settlement clinging to the familiar slope of its hill. The post-palatial generations lived in the shadow of what had been, yet their lives were marked less by nostalgia than by the practical demands of survival. They planted, harvested, tended animals, and repaired their homes without monumental ambition. To them, the massive stone foundations scattered across the hill were not relics of a golden age, but simply part of the landscape, useful as sources of building material or as windbreaks against the gales from the sea. Over time, even those utilitarian ties weakened. By the early Iron Age, population shifts saw many communities in Messenia relocate closer to new centers of activity, sometimes nearer to the coast, sometimes inland to more defensible ground. Nichoria's hill, though still habitable, offered no grand strategic advantage and little in the way of untapped resources. The settlement shrank, its footprint contracting until it was little more than a cluster of small houses surrounded by fields. With fewer inhabitants, the monumental ruins deteriorated further, their stones scavenged or tumbled under the weight of centuries of frost and rain. Yet the hill endured as a quiet constant in the shifting patterns of habitation. In the archaic and classical periods, when the city-states of Greece rose to prominence, Nichoria's slope may have supported scattered farmsteads or seasonal grazing. No written record ties the name Nichoria to these eras, but the persistence of human activity in the area is likely, given the enduring fertility of the surrounding plain. If there were stories about the ruins, tales of a vanished ruler, a lost treasure, or a city swallowed by divine wrath, they have left no trace in the surviving corpus of Greek myth. Nichoria's legacy was silence. The Byzantine period saw new waves of building across Messenia, often repurposing ancient sites for churches, monasteries, or defensive outposts. Whether Nichoria's hill was among them is uncertain. No clear architectural remains from the period have been confirmed. Still, its elevated position and commanding views would have made it a natural choice for any community seeking a vantage point over the plain. Perhaps a shepherd's chapel once stood here, its whitewashed walls catching the sun in the same way the palace's painted plaster had in the Mycenaean age. Centuries later, during the Ottoman period, the land around Nichoria was folded into the empire's agrarian system, its hills and valleys parceled out for cultivation or pasture. By then, any memory of the Mycenaean palace was buried under the slow accumulation of soil and debris. The visible stones were simply old. Too old to be meaningful without the key of historical knowledge. The ancient world lay dormant, waiting for the discipline of archaeology to awaken it. That awakening came in the 20th century, when archaeologists began systematic surveys of Messenia. At first, Nichoria was little more than a name on a map, one of many low hills marked as potential sites of interest. Local farmers knew the ground yielded occasional sherds of ancient pottery, but such finds were common in Greece, where every field seemed to hold a fragment of the past. It was only when excavation began in earnest, most notably under the University of Minnesota Messenia expedition in the 1960s and 1970s, that the true scope of Nichoria's history emerged. The excavations revealed not only the outlines of the post-palatial village, but also the substantial remains of the Mycenaean palace beneath. Walls, foundations, storage rooms, and artifacts spoke of a once flourishing administrative center, linked by trade and politics to the greater Mycenaean world. In some cases, the archaeological record was startlingly well preserved. Hearths still in place, floors intact, storage jars resting where they had stood centuries before. These discoveries transformed Nichoria from a quiet rural hill into a significant piece of the puzzle of late Bronze Age Greece. The site offered rare insight into both the height of Mycenaean power and its aftermath. It showed how a palace-centered community could survive, albeit in diminished form, through the turbulent centuries that followed the collapse. It illuminated patterns of continuity and change in settlement, economy, and social structure, patterns that resonated with the broader history of the region. Today, Nichoria's ruins are less frequented than the grand citadels of Mycenae or Tiryns, but for those who make the journey, the hill offers something uniquely compelling. There is no visitor center, no floodlit walls or reconstructed gates, only the quiet rise, the cicadas in the grass, and the view across the Mycenaean plain. Standing there, one can trace the faint lines of the palace's footprint, imagine the Megaron's columns lifting toward the sky, and feel the pull of a story that spans 3,000 years. In the stillness, the echoes of Nichoria's past are both faint and profound. They speak not in the grand language of kings and conquests, but in the subtle persistence of place. This was a hill of ambition and loss, of adaptation and survival, of memory buried and memory recovered. It is a reminder that history is not only in the monuments that endure, but also in the landscapes that hold their shape long after the walls have fallen. From here, the narrative turns to reflection, to what the fate of the lost Mycenaean palace of Nichoria can tell us about the cycles of human endeavor, the fragility of complexity, and the resilience of those who carry on when the world they knew has vanished. The story of Nichoria is not the tale of a single moment, but of a long rhythm of rise, flourishing, collapse, and endurance. From the height of its Mycenaean palace, its storerooms brimming with grain, its hearths glowing in the Megaron, its scribes etching tablets in the script of kings, to the smoldering end that left timbers charred and walls broken, Nichoria's arc mirrors the larger patterns of human civilization. We build, we organize, we reach outward to weave ourselves into networks of trade and alliance. And then, by forces beyond our control or mistakes of our own making, those networks falter. What remains is the land itself, holding the imprint of what once was. In Nichoria's case, the palace was not merely a building. It was a system, a delicate choreography of agriculture, redistribution, craft production, and political authority. Its collapse reminds us that complexity, for all its brilliance, carries fragility. A break in one link, be it environmental hardship, economic disruption, or military defeat, can send ripples through the whole. And yet, the end of the palace was not the end of the people. Life continued, reshaped into smaller, more flexible forms. The inhabitants of post-palatial Nichoria prove that survival does not always require the preservation of grandeur. Sometimes it requires letting go of it. The centuries of obscurity that followed did not erase Nichoria's existence, even if they did erase its name from living memory. This is the quiet lesson the site offers. History is often buried not by deliberate destruction, but by the slow layering of time. Fields are plowed, stones are taken for new walls, roofs collapse and are swallowed by soil, and the events that once shaped lives become invisible. And yet, under that soil, the traces endure, waiting for eyes trained to see, hands willing to dig, and minds ready to interpret. When archaeologists returned the palace to light in the 20th century, they were not simply uncovering walls and artifacts. They were restoring a chapter to the human record, one that had been silent for 3 millennia. Every post hole, every sherd of pottery, every charred beam spoke in a language that transcended centuries. These remnants are not just evidence of what happened, they are evidence that it mattered. Today, the hill of Nichoria stands quietly, its summit brushed by wind, its slopes clothed in grass and scattered wildflowers. It is not marked by the spectacle of tourist crowds or towering reconstructions, but by the intimacy of place. To walk there is to feel both the weight and the lightness of history, the weight of knowing that lives were lived here with the same depth of hope, fear, and ambition as ours, the lightness of realizing that the land carries it all without bitterness. What happened to the lost Mycenaean palace of Nichoria? It fell as all things fall. But it also remained, as all places remain in some form. The walls crumbled, the roof beams rotted, the storerooms emptied, Yet the shape of the hill and the stories held in its soil persisted. The palace is gone, but the land remembers. This is the truth that stretches beyond Messenia, beyond the late Bronze Age, beyond archaeology itself. We are temporary, but we are not without trace. Whether through ruins, oral traditions, written words, or the memories we leave in others, something endures. And just as Nichoria's rediscovery reconnected the present to a forgotten past, so too will future generations look back on us, piecing together our own cycles of building and breaking, flourishing and fading. The story ends here, but only for now. The hill still stands, the earth still holds its secrets, and somewhere under the grass, in a place where sunlight hasn't touched for thousands of years, the lost palace of Nichoria waits for its next telling.